Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's program, which will examine the state of the COVID-19 pandemic globally, nationally, and locally. Our discussion could not be more timely. The widespread availability of vaccines in the US and Illinois has created a sense of hope and optimism, but also one tempered by resistance to the vaccine among a cross-section of Americans and ongoing flare-ups in various states. Huge global challenges remain. Beyond the current crisis in India, infection rates remain high in countries ranging from Brazil to Sweden. And then there's the biggest challenge of all, which is getting the world, especially the developing world, enough vaccines and the infrastructure to administer them. I'm honored to welcome our distinguished panel who will address those issues and more. Dr. Seth Berkley, CEO of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the National Institute of Health, and Dr. Ngozi Ezike, Director of the Illinois Department of Public Health. And we're fortunate to be joined by Club Director Dr. Helene Gayle, President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, who will moderate today's discussion. Before joining the Trust, Dr. Gayle spent much of her career in leadership roles for domestic and global public health organizations, such as the Centers for Disease Control, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the international humanitarian organization, CARE. Relevant to this panel, she was co-chair of the Committee of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine study that developed the national framework for the equitable distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. We will begin today's program with a conversation between Dr. Gayle and our panelists, during which we encourage you to submit your own questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the conversation, I will rejoin and ask the top voted questions submitted by our members. Now, out of respect to the limited time we have this morning, let me briefly introduce our guests. However, their full biographies can be found on our website. Dr. Seth Berkley was named CEO of Gavi in 2011, directing its mission to protect the world's poorest children by improving access to new and underused vaccines. In its 20-year history, it has reached 820 million children in the 73 poorest countries. It is using that expertise to co-lead the global effort on equitable access to the COVID-19 vaccines. As head of the NIH, Dr. Francis Collins oversees the largest biomedical research funding source in the world. And it was NIH's foundational research long underway before the current pandemic that allowed a COVID-19 vaccine to be developed in record time. Dr. Ngozi Ezike has served as the IDPH's director for over 15 years and has been a central player in the state's response to the COVID-19 crisis. As Governor J.B. Pritzker's lead public health advisor, she also plays a key role in establishing the state's reopening guidelines and timeline. So thank you all for joining us today. Helene, I now turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, David, and welcome everyone. I also just want to add my thanks to our three panelists. We know how much you have going on and really appreciate your willingness to spend a little bit of time with us. For those of you who are visiting from Geneva and from DC and Maryland, and welcome to Chicago, and Ngozi, thanks for being here as always. And I would just add for all of you, Seth, who has been a friend and colleague for far too many more decades than we like to admit. Francis, who has ably led the NIH through 3 presidents and helped us to understand the genetic code, as well as being outspoken on how science and faith are not diametrically opposed, and really brought an important perspective. And Ngozi, who has been such a compassionate public health leader throughout this crisis, a real shiro in my mind. So it's wonderful to have all of you here. And again, thank you. Let me just start maybe from each of your perspective, global, national, and then the local and state perspective, a little bit on how you think we're doing. And maybe, just starting with you, Seth, from a global perspective, give a little bit of background on COVAX and, the role that Gavi has played in this pandemic, and how you look at the world and where we are, not just with vaccine, but broadly speaking, what's the map, what's the landscape look like?
So thanks, Helene, and it's great to be with my other panelists. Let me start, and I know Francis will talk about this. When we knew this pandemic began, we knew we needed a number of things. We needed short-term interventions. We'll talk about those. We needed vaccines, and we're going to need plenty of those. And we needed vaccinations, and that's really getting the vaccines into people. And on the science of vaccines, it's been extraordinary. 327 days from the time the genetic code was published to the first vaccine being injected in a person not in a clinical trial. Extraordinary. On the vaccinations, we had previous experience in 2009 with the swine flu pandemic, where we saw wealthy countries buy up most of the vaccines and have them not be available in developing countries. So that's what we were trying to avoid. We decided to create an initiative called COVAX. And initially, of course, we focused on the poorest countries, knowing that they might be left behind. But then we realized we needed to make it more global. And so this new organism was born. It was, we ended up with 190 countries coming together to work together on vaccine equity, 191, given that the US joined in January. And the purpose of this really was to try to move forward on having equitable access of vaccines. And the answer is we've certainly talked about equity. We talked about the importance of making sure that we're not safe unless everyone's safe, and therefore having global protection. I'm not sure it was believed at the beginning. I think now with variants, which we'll talk about, I think people believe it more. But let me just put what the numbers are. High-income countries, about a third of the populations have received a vaccine. In upper middle income countries, it's about 10%. In lower middle income countries, about 5%. And in low income countries, 0.2%. So this is not equity. We've distributed now to 121 countries, about 50 million doses. But the challenge we've had is with export bans, with vaccines having been locked up and being hoarded, it's been very hard to get doses for the developing world. We have bought 2 billion doses, and we'll make sure those are available, but those are going to be available later. And what we need now is to make sure that we can get vaccines out to everybody to cover the healthcare workers and high-risk groups around the world. And I think that is the challenge that is in front of us.
Both of us were very involved in the global HIV/AIDS pandemic, where we saw initiatives like PEPFAR that the US developed to be able to get treatment to people in particularly Africa and Asia. Do we need another PEPFAR? Do we have enough effort moving forward to be able to accomplish the things that we know need to be accomplished? What will it take? Where is the biggest gaps?
So, I mean, there were really two things that were necessary. One was going to be money to buy vaccines. Of course, when we started this, there was no money. There were no people working on it. Donors have been extraordinary. We've raised $6.7 billion for this. And what's important about that is not just having, that money, but then the doses. And that has been a little bit more of a challenge, as we talked about. Now, one hopeful thing is not only that we've been able to acquire lots of vaccines, but also that countries bought a portfolio of vaccines. Why did they do that? We had no idea whether any of these vaccines were going to work. So countries bought lots of different ones. And it's estimated that there's somewhere between 1 to 2 billion doses that will be surplus doses that go beyond the needs to cover the population. populations. And our hope is that those will be freed up as soon as possible to go ahead and make those vaccines available, to try to get some vaccine equity and to try to really slow down the global pandemic. Remembering this is a global pandemic, it requires a global response, and that's what's critical. Lastly, just to say, do we have the systems in place? We work as a network with, WHO, the World Bank, CEPI, UNICEF. We were able to serve or reach 121 countries because we have this networked effort. So we don't really have a problem now in getting vaccines out. The challenge is going to be getting those vaccines.
So, Francis, let me turn to you kind of from a national perspective, and maybe giving a little bit of perspective. There's been, it's seemingly more ups than downs. We were able to get vaccines in record time, but would you talk a bit about what did that mean? What were some of the challenges? And then, this race between vaccination and the virus, where do you think we are? And how hopeful are you that we'll get to a level that will allow us to really contain this here in the United States?
Well, I'm glad to do that, and glad to be on this panel with Seth and Ngozi and with you, Helene, as our moderator. And I'm glad we're talking about this, not just national and not just local and not just global, but all of those together. The boundaries between these particular definitions of local area or large scale area are very blurry, and viruses don't care about those boundaries at all. For me, as the director of the NIH, it has been an amazing experience over the last 15 months to preside over a empowerment of the scientific community to go for broke in ways that were absolutely essential for us to get to where we are now, although we still have a long ways to go. To see in those brief, less than a year, about 11 months, going from the sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to having 2 approved messenger RNA-based vaccines was almost beyond what one could have hoped for, especially that it turns out we have 95% efficacy and a very reassuring safety record as well. That was almost more than I dared to hope for. Tony Fauci and I, back in August and September, were kind of like making bets about what the efficacy would be. And none of us dared to bet 95%, and yet that's what we got. So we are incredibly fortunate that science came to the rescue here. And it's important, as you said at the beginning, that this didn't come out of nowhere. It was 25 years of building on the idea of how messenger RNA could be a valuable approach and a very rapid approach to vaccination that got us here. And we shouldn't forget how important it is that that foundation was there and had already been tried out for SARS and MERS, and people like Barney Graham had figured out some very important features of that spike protein that needed to be tweaked if the vaccine was going to really work well. So that's all the good news part of it. But there's plenty of things that didn't go well. Our testing efforts early on did not go well. Only now do I think we're really at the point where we're starting to have the kind of testing that you'd want to have, which is point of care, available to almost everybody in a very rapid turnaround. Get your answer in 15 minutes, or even get yourself tested at home, as we are now running a pilot in North Carolina that was on the front page of the Washington Post this morning. All of that built on technologies that we supported through something called RADx, a rapid acceleration of diagnostics, a program that the Congress funded and that we started exactly 1 year ago today, and which has led to no less than 34 new large-scale technologies that are collectively in the US providing 2 million tests a day. All of that was important, but I wish we'd had it sooner, of course. And therapeutics, let's be clear, we did all the right things there. I pulled together this partnership with 20 pharmaceutical companies called Active, and we prioritized amongst hundreds and hundreds of possible therapeutic candidates for repurposing, the ones that seemed like they would be the most beneficial. And we helped stimulate the development of monoclonals. And we got some, pretty good results. Maybe in the baseball analogy, we got singles and a couple of doubles, but we didn't get home runs. The home run would be an oral agent that's highly effective and safe that you give to somebody as soon as they have a positive test, and it scares that virus away. And now that's where we are at this point, trying to develop that next generation of specific antivirals, the way we did for HIV 25 years ago, and which we really need to do for coronaviruses and other threatening pandemics. That's one of the lessons learned we might come to. In terms of where we are in the country, I mean, I'm excited that we have gotten to the point in just a few months of 54% of adults with at least one dose of a vaccine that we know is safe and effective. And for those over 65, that's now 82% of those who have at least one dose. So that's looking good. On the other hand, we're starting to see a slowdown in the acceptance of those doses. And there's 120 million adults who haven't started yet, and many of them signaling that they're not sure they're interested in starting. And since we know that you got to get to a certain level of immunity in order to really have the viral outbreaks start to fade away, we have a lot of work yet to do. And so many of us are focused now on how to get the message out about the positives, not just the finger wagging, you should do this, but what a difference it can make to your life experience to be immunized, to start to gather together with other people, to hug each other again, not to be on Zoom calls all the time. Oh, sorry. All of those things that we have kind of gotten used to, but we really don't like, and we could be freed up from if we can get full endorsement and embrace by the whole population. So a lot of effort maybe now trying to go there. Finally, though, let me say, my heart breaks when I look at the rest of the world. And yes, we Americans, we put a huge amount of money into this, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars. So it's understandable, that's the taxpayers' money, that they should certainly reap some of the benefit. But it's time for us to really now that we are in a place of having enough doses for Americans to really reach out much more aggressively. And President Biden's starting to do that now by promising doses of AstraZeneca to India as soon as they can be cleared by FDA and other matters. We are going to need to be a big player in this effort. One of the things I'm excited about is the idea in the longer term, but not too long a term, in actually building manufacturing capacity in other places like Africa. So the next time this comes around, it won't be this problem of having to figure out how the rich countries are going to share when they maybe want to treat their own people first. Let's have manufacturing in Senegal. Let's have manufacturing expanded in South Africa or in Kenya. We could do that, but it's going to take the full efforts of African leaders and of the rest of the world being willing to contribute to tech transfer and not get all hung up on intellectual property.
Very true. And you know, I think it not only is important for health, but it's also a potential economic aspect that you know will also help health. So if we're able to create new industries in places where there are not, and manufacturing capability, you know, in the end, it helps us all. Would you just one of the things that has come up recently has been a lot of discussion around the origins. Was this a laboratory accident? You know, was this transmitted through other species? What difference does it make? And, you know, how do we go about investigating that?
Well, it isn't going to change the situation we're in right now, but I think there is a reason to try to understand how this came about and perhaps what steps need to be taken to diminish the chance of a recurrence of this sort. I don't have any inside information about exactly how this came about. Obviously, the closest relative to the genome of SARS-CoV-2 was a bat virus that had been sequenced several years earlier from a cave in China. Exactly how that managed to find its way into the human species has not been resolved. I think the original WHO investigation left everybody feeling a little unsatisfied, shall we say, including the WHO Director General himself, Tedros, who's called for more. And we in the US agree that it would be useful to do more of that. The Department of State and Department of HHS, Department of Agriculture, several other federal agencies now putting together information to send to WHO about what we think a second investigation might need to look like in order to try to get better answers.
Thank you. And Ngozi, you know, this has been a real roller coaster ride for you, and many of us have been part of watching you and your what were daily updates, and you know, going from a kind of a place of frustration as we saw cases mount and continue to spread throughout the state to now having vaccines available. Could you give us a flavor for how it is at the state level? How do you see things, and what are, you know, what have been some of your biggest triumphs and successes, but where are some of the biggest challenges that currently remain?
Well, thank you again for having me. I'm so excited to be here with the Economic Club and with these esteemed panelists. So, no, right now I think it's we're proud of where we are here in the state of Illinois. We're just ecstatic that over the weekend the 9th million vaccine was administered into an arm, and again, just a tremendous feat that to have. We're above the national average for the states in terms of having, I think, 55 or 56% of Illinoisans, eligible Illinoisans, with that first dose, and pushing the 80% of our seniors. So we're ecstatic about that. But as we all understand, like all the people who were guided by the science and believed in the science and wanted the vaccine and have been waiting for the vaccine and were waiting to become eligible, all those people have eagerly gotten vaccinated and turned vaccines into vaccination. And so we know that the last miles of the marathon are going to be much slower than what we've done for those first miles in terms of the vaccination journey. And so it's a completely different game that we're turning to now. The mass vaccine, the mass vaccination sites, churning out 5,000 vaccines in a day. The utility of some of that is fading. And so now it's a really intense ground game, being very specific for specific communities, finding the right messages, all of that is what we're turning to. But we're really proud of the intense collaboration with the 97 different local health departments that we've been working with. Of course, all the cross collaboration across public, private, businesses, of course, have become great partners in a way that public health hasn't interacted so closely before. Testing, we were the first state to have that CDC assay available for use for testing here in Illinois, and that allowed us to identify cases much quicker than sending it to the CDC and waiting weeks for results. So we have continued to innovate and be nimble, and we know that we'll continue to do that because we keep, curveballs keep coming, but we're really happy with where we are, but know that there are lots of lessons learned, and what probably won't be another 100 years till the next pandemic. So we're excited to learn all that we can and be even more prepared for whatever comes the next time around.
So, one of the things that I think Illinois did well was, to strike a good balance between speed and equity. And, clearly equity and making sure that populations that have been most impacted were able to access the vaccines. Could you say a little bit about how you balance that? We talked a lot about, getting as many shots into people's arms. I mean, that was something that we heard a lot, which sometimes was at odds with, are we making sure that it gets to the communities where it's needed the most? How did you strike that balance? And, how has hesitancy and communities and it's a wide range of communities that have different reasons for lack of confidence and lack of trust. How have you balanced some of those issues, speed, equity, and hesitancy?
Yeah, we said from the beginning that this was going to be the surgical approach as well as the hammer approach, and we were going to use them together. That it was very clear that rapidity without equity would result in continued disparity, and we weren't going to have that. We've made that intentional since the beginning. We have a health equity work group that's embedded into the COVID response team that is on every meeting, on every huddle, and it involves a lot of community members, different advocacy group leaders that are holding our feet to the fire to make sure that no group is left behind. And so we have been so intentional, as we have the mass vac sites, but we know that those are not a one size fits all. So we've also, I'm calling up mega church leaders in Black communities, and we're going to Vietnamese Buddhist temples, and we're working with the migrant workers. So we've been very intentional identifying all of these groups, the homeless, people who are homebound, people who are differently able, disabled, making sure that no group was left out and that we had specific strategies appropriate for the relevant county or jurisdiction to engage and support those populations to get vaccinated as well.
Thank you. Let me go back to talking a bit about the global perspective, Seth. And, as I listen to all three of you, this has been an all out and out effort just to get a single dose or second dose to people, their first vaccination, a complete series of vaccination. And we are now thinking that it may take, whether it's annual or, some repeated effort to be able to keep people safe from COVID, and that we aren't necessarily looking at lifelong immunity. So do we have the systems in place at a global level to be able to think about repeated vaccines, and how are you looking at that at the global level? What is it going to take for us to really be able to face this, and what might be some of the systems changes that we need to think about as well?
So thanks for the question. And I just want to say, because both of my colleagues spoke about the evolutionary certainty of more outbreaks. I think that's just, really important to say. And let's remember that, yes, we should try to figure out where this came from, but this is the third coronavirus in the last 2 decades that has popped out. And we know that before that, there were another 4. So we would be silly to not think that there may not be more, but also influenza, other diseases, disease X, as we like to call it. So that's why developing the surveillance, the resilient health systems, the manufacturing capacity that Francis talked about is so critical. In general, in at least the poorest countries, adult vaccinations are not a big, something that's done regularly. And so although we have that with things like pneumonia vaccines and flu vaccines and herpes zoster vaccines, shingles, that's not done, at least in the low-income countries. And frankly, the coverage even in middle-income countries is not that good. So that really is going to be a change. Now, the good news is immunization is the most widely distributed health intervention in the world. We reach more than 90% of the world's, children with at least one dose of routine vaccine. We're working to try to make that as close to 100% as we can, chasing the 0-dose children, chasing those that are under-immunized. So I think this is a little bit of a mind shift. And as we do that mind shift, which by the way has some good things to it, it's more about prevention than it is about treatment. And we know that prevention tends to be under-invested in and treatment overvalued. So the more we can get societies to think about that, the better we are. And then, of course, if we can build in systems to vaccinate adults, if it's required, then we can do things like do screening for important chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension, other things that aren't necessarily routinely done, as well as provide interventions for those populations. So it really has to be a rethink. Of course, our hope is that the immunity lasts for a long time. We don't know that. We also don't know whether we'll need some variant-specific vaccines in the future if it turns out that we keep seeing variants that are harder to neutralize. So there's lots of questions out there. We need to be flexible, but we also need to take advantage of it. And there, I think business has a real role to play. You mentioned the business community. We also need new technologies, because how do we track all of these vaccines, do better jobs on supply chain, be able to work on being able to send reminders, as Ngozi talked about, having communities get the information they need in their local languages, et cetera. So there's lots of opportunity for us to make transformation that will help with this pandemic and future ones.
So you mentioned variant-specific vaccines. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Francis, and what the NIH and others are thinking about in terms of the future of the evolution of SARS-CoV-2, how we're keeping track with that. And then, just in general, I think this has been a real boost to vaccine and looking at vaccines. Treatments have always, in some ways, gotten more attention than vaccines. Has this been a real boost? And are we going to see a real revolution in vaccines as a even more important tool in looking at disease and disease prevention?
Well, two great questions and connected questions. If you wanted to teach a course in biological evolution, you could take SARS-CoV-2 and it would teach you everything you could imagine you needed to put into that lecture, because it has shown us exactly what happens when you have a genome sequence that is, because it's a coronavirus, not highly mutable. It's not as bad as HIV, but it does have a mutation rate. And then you put that into millions, hundreds of millions of people, each one of whom has a very large viral load, and even a rare event is sufficient to result in an opportunity for some gain of function to happen naturally that leads to that virus being somewhat more successful. And then that emerges. On top of that, we see instances, as several of them, where the newly emerging and more successful virus doesn't just have one change. It has maybe as many as a dozen. And we have the pretty good reasons to believe that those come about in individuals who are immunosuppressed, who are unable to completely rid their bodies of the virus over a long period of time. So there's a longer period for additional steps to happen. We are quite concerned about those variants, and these are not at all hypothetical anymore. In the United States, data I saw yesterday, 59% of the isolates in the US are B117, which is the variant that was first described in the United Kingdom, and which we know is about 50 to 70% more contagious and also maybe 20% more lethal. So this is not one you would want to have, and we've got it. And there's others that are also of concern because of whether they might, in fact, evade the success of our current vaccines. B117 happily seems to be well covered by our current vaccines. B1351, which now dominates South Africa, is probably covered by our vaccines, but you do lose something there. And the big concern for many of us in the last couple of weeks is B1617, which is the variant in India, which we know less about, which has a lot of the same mutations as the South Africa version, but has not yet been rigorously tested to see whether the vaccines protect against it. And then what's next? So we have to be prepared for the fact that these are going to keep happening, and that the time may come where a variant appears for which our current vaccines, based on the sequence of the original Wuhan virus, are simply not protective enough. And then a booster would be needed. And of course, we don't want to be caught flat-footed. And so companies that are making vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna and J&J are already in the process, and some already in clinical trials, of a next generation, most of those focused on the South African variant, because that's the one that seems to be the greatest threat right now. I don't know whether we're going to need boosters. I think that was part of your question. I mean, it could be that one of these emerges and we have to have it to protect against a complete reoccurrence of the pandemic. Or it could just be that vaccination doesn't last for years and years and years, that the antibody titers fade over time, and you need to re-immunize against the original virus just to keep that protection there. We're somewhat reassured that in sort of 6 to 9 months, it doesn't look as if antibody titers are dropping very much for immunized people, and that's good news. But you can't expect that this is going to be like measles where you're vaccinated for life. That would be almost too much to hope for. So I think we have a lot to pay attention to, and we may very well need to think about capacity for manufacturing, not just the first time for everybody, but maybe also that booster. I don't know when it'll be, but we need to not be caught flat-footed if that's what is required. And then you asked about technology. I do think the messenger RNA success has opened up a lot of people's eyes to things that we could do now much more ably than we could before. I mean, take cancer vaccines, which in the past have been talked about, but the cycle time was so long in terms of how you would design a vaccine for a particular person's cancer that they would either be cured or dead by the time you had the vaccine ready to go. This moves the needle forward in reality check there substantially. Watch that space and see what happens with cancer vaccines. And almost any pathogen, as we're now contemplating the pandemic preparedness discussion. Why are we not now designing and implementing and doing animal testing for the next sort of top 10 lists of emerging pathogens, so that we already are pretty far along down that path if we need it, instead of waiting and hoping that it won't happen? It's a thinkable thought.
Thank you. Yeah, and I couldn't help but notice that we've gotten, for the first time in a long time, some positive news about an HIV vaccine. And so, it is wonderful to see this kind of renaissance, if you will, in looking at vaccines and having these technologies that, can hopefully really make a big difference to a wider range of things than we ever thought vaccines could. So, Ngozi, maybe just it'd be good to hear a little bit from you around, some of these issues of preparedness and, our public health infrastructure. We know that there are huge federal dollars coming down the pike to Illinois that, hopefully will be helpful in strengthening our public health infrastructure. What lessons have you learned from what we've done for COVID, and how that can help us with the overall public health infrastructure? And maybe say a little bit about your thoughts on how these federal dollars that are coming down the pike can be useful, not just for today, but in strengthening things in the long run.
Well, they always say, don't let a good crisis go to waste. We highlighted things that we already knew, right? COVID didn't create all these things that, like, oh, wow, I didn't realize. Like, we've known that our public health infrastructure was weak. At the state health department, it had been defunded over decades and was just not what it should be, especially for a state like Illinois in terms of its vastness, its population. When I walked into the agency really just 2 years ago, we had total of 2.25 physicians in the agency working, one infectious disease doc. And so, we have so many, the lack, other states maybe have, for our size, maybe had about 90 epidemiologists, and we have something in the 20s. So we knew that there were significant gaps. And so we are looking forward to using those dollars. It's really a lot of human resource. Of course, there are technological resources, updating, softwares and data management systems. We need more informaticists. So it's really a lot of people resource that has been very scarce. There are 97 local health departments, and we can't, some of these local health departments consist of 3 people. And so we can't think that each local health department can do their own thing. That capacity has to be at the state level, where we have, the specialists that can help when there's a specific problem in a specific jurisdiction, that we can lend the expertise, that we can mine the data to show them what's happening in their region, and have enough people that we can crisscross around the state. Infection preventionists, we know how important that is. We had 3, and unfortunately we even had one go on retirement, and even one pass away during this time. So just the human resource is going to be a main place that we use some of those federal dollars. Of course, we will also be giving substantial dollars to the local health departments themselves to see how they can support themselves, have the data, the data upgrades, technology upgrades that are necessary as well.
Great. So let me just, I think I have time for maybe one more question for each of you, and maybe we'll take some of these quickly. But, there's been a lot of discussion about making vaccines mandatory, and how we think about those. It would be interesting to get each of your perspectives on, what do you think the future of vaccine policy should be, and should we be thinking about this as mandatory? What are some of the pluses and minuses, and how might that feed into people's willingness to get the vaccine one way or the other? Maybe Ngozi, start with you.
Well, we know that if it's mandatory, the uptake goes up quite a bit, but there's also a significant backlash. I think a lot of the groundwork that needs to be done. I keep thinking about when I was little, there was this, the schoolhouse rock, and how a law becomes a bill, and there were some things that you just learned as a child. And I think we never had that with vaccines, for people to understand the importance of vaccines. And vaccines have been so effective that they've hurt themselves, and that people minimize, their effect or the importance of them, because the diseases that they have eradicated, nobody thinks about. No kids jumping around with braces from polio, because no one has polio. And so, just the ground game in terms of reestablishing with our preschoolers on up about what exactly vaccines do, how they work, so that there isn't that pushback from them, but rather that embrace. I think that's a very important place to be, because mandating things, then you have people who just find workarounds or exemptions or ways to still avoid it if they're not bought in that this is an important thing that they need to do.
And Seth, not just this issue of whether you mandate it, but throughout the global world, there is the national vaccine hesitancy, and so there have been a variety of different ways in which different countries have embraced or have denied the importance of vaccine. How are you seeing it, not necessarily on an individual level, but kind of on a country level?
Well, first of all, if you wanted to mandate vaccines, you'd have to have vaccines. So I need the vaccines first. But all joking aside, I think what's interesting is it used to be, for exactly the reason Ngozi mentioned, that vaccine hesitancy was actually higher in wealthy countries. And the reason is that they don't know about these diseases. So the country that had the highest vaccine hesitancy was actually France, the land of Louis Pasteur. And the lowest in the world was actually in Rwanda. And the reason developing countries didn't have the same level was because they saw the diseases. And of course, nobody, when they see the diseases, wants their families, their children to get those diseases. So you're absolutely right. Part of this is education, but you don't really want to also have scare tactics. But how do we turn this into a positive message going forward? Now, I must say it's been a little different with COVID vaccines, because initially it was so politically charged, and all of these rumors were going around and misinformation. And of course, the internet today means that, the same thing that's being looked at in Illinois is being looked at in northern Nigeria, on the same platforms. And that has really posed a very different problem. So there is now hesitancy that we have to deal with. And the challenge for us is, as people see the vaccines being rolled out, as they see them working, as they see they're safe, as health workers and local community leaders, religious leaders that Ngozi talked about are engaged, that's how you really move this forward. But by the way, it hasn't helped a little bit, the stop and starting. AstraZeneca was the vaccine that was most widely provided for developing countries, given that it was a 2 to 8 degree vaccine, didn't require the ultra cold chain, and also used conventional manufacturing. And as you know, there was a lot of different, both lack of knowledge, then misinformation about it, and stop and starts, and that has affected people's confidence. And what you don't want is a situation where people think, the mRNA vaccines, that's what's good for wealthy countries, and, less wealthy countries get a different vaccine. That's a really bad message. And it's why we're buying all vaccines, including our mRNA vaccines, although some countries right now with the cold chain, we can't use them. But the idea is to make it seem as if these are truly global vaccines, because I think that's the right way to think about this.
Yeah, and Francis, just to add, kind of expand on that a little bit, I think because we've only had the time that we've had with these vaccines, not even a year yet, it is likely that we may see further side effects over time. And so, in light of things like the J&J pause, and the fact that and AstraZeneca, and the fact that we may see further side effects the longer we follow this, with millions of people getting vaccinated, how do you balance, we want all people vaccinated, and maybe even moving to some mandate, to the fact that we will probably have increasing episodes, instances of side effects that, may necessitate pausing or looking more closely? How do you balance those things?
Well, I think the balance we're trying to achieve is to save the most lives. And when we sort of talk about the risks of the vaccine, In that same sentence, we should be talking about the risk of not getting the vaccine. And at the present time, the comparison in terms of risks to your life are dramatic in terms of the vaccine benefits. One of the reasons we run very large clinical trials of vaccines, 30,000 or more, is so that we would know if there was a reasonably common serious adverse event, and you would then decide we're not going to authorize that one. So anything that gets to the point of authorization, you've already looked for. Anything that happens within the first couple of months, which is when almost all severe adverse events do happen, to a substantial number of people that you would see in a group of 30,000. So we already can sort of say if there's going to be something downstream, it would be rare, like this thrombotic thrombocytopenic syndrome that has now been identified for J&J, or it would be extremely late in arriving, which is not really expected to happen. So everybody should kind of be reassured by that it's not as if we rushed this through and just hoped for the best. There was an awful lot of attention to safety questions. And I hope also people will see when you have to do a pause, and I think it was the right thing with J&J to take 10 days and try to be sure there weren't other cases out there that had been missed, that is an indication that actually the system works, that here was something that was happening 1 in a million, and we knew about it, and it was enough to be able to say, okay, let's look closely, and then to do the analysis of benefits versus risk and say it's still a great benefit. My grandson and my granddaughter both got immunized with J&J, and I was glad for that. And I was strongly supportive of their decision because they just wanted 1 dose. And let's be clear, that's a real benefit in lots of parts of the world, including some places in the US. And we shouldn't overlook that either as part of the equation of how we make these decisions.
Last question, and I'm going to then turn it over to David very quickly. What's the biggest lesson learned from the COVID pandemic for each of you? Just lightning round quickly. Seth. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, having some contingent financing available and some surge capacity, because of course, having to go out and try to raise money and try to, get staff meant we couldn't move as quickly. Francis talked about how dramatically the US was able to move. We need to make sure that that's available globally as well.
Francis.
Doing things in unconventional ways when you need to, and we can adapt that in the future, having the opportunity to build vaccines this quickly, having NIH step into the role of being a venture capitalist for developing new kinds of testing technologies. Those are lessons that we are pretty excited about applying. If you heard the president last night talking about a new part of NIH called ARPA-H, sort of bringing the DARPA attitude to health, that is all springing out of this experience and something we'd be very excited about applying to cancer, to Alzheimer's, to diabetes, to sickle cell disease, all of those things, which I think when you have a targeted approach that you can kind of see how to get there, the standard approach doesn't quite do it, and we ought to be more aggressive and bolder. And we're going to do that based on this experience of the last 15 months.
That's great. And finally, Ngozi, last word, and then I'll turn it over to David.
Yeah, I think, we always think about, in terms of public health, epidemiologists and statisticians, but I think what we've overlooked is the importance of the communication specialists, and that has been such a significant part of this whole journey, and that really a sincere appreciation and focus on how we message and how we communicate with the public has just been something that we won't forget how important that is and how critical that team will be for anything that we do in the future as well.
Great, thanks. And you've been an excellent communicator for this state throughout this. So thanks to all 3 of you for the time. And I will now turn it over to David for some of the audience questions.
And Helene, thank you for leading such an inspiring conversation, as well as everything else you do for the club. So we have just about 10 minutes. I'm going to try to get about 3 or 4 questions in very, very quickly. I'm going to start with Dr. Berkley and Dr. Collins. Dr. Berkley, you mentioned the need for the rest of the world to get more vaccine inventory as quickly as possible. What would your ask be of Dr. Collins? And Dr. Collins, you mentioned that we've already given some AstraZeneca vaccines to the world. What is your response going to be to kind of accelerating that effort? So Dr. Berkley, I'll let you ask the question first and then let Dr. Collins respond.
So I'd ask Francis for three things, although I know he doesn't control these things. But one is we can't have export restrictions on raw materials and supplies that are necessary for vaccine production. We have now 24,000 liters of facilities that are stuck because we don't have some of the materials. So that's critical. Second is to make sure that we can get a prioritization for global and not just national. He talked about the right reasons for it to be national. And then the last part is to help us with some of the excess doses and to make sure they get distributed equitably, because the challenge right now is we can chase the places that seem like they have the highest infections, but we also need to make sure that we're preventing the next country that's going to get it. And that's really about vaccinating all healthcare workers and all high-risk people across the world.
So Seth, those are great things to ask for, and I'm resonating strongly with all of them. I will tell you, my understanding is there are no legal export controls anymore. It's sort of de facto, though, that the Defense Production Act has made it possible for the U.S. to claim the output of critical materials before it's sent anywhere else. And when those materials are in short supply, effectively, we're preventing them from being exported, although there's no legal statement saying there's controls. I really want to see that get better. And of course, the solution to that is to have the supplies get to the point where they're actually meeting the demands. As the US is getting very close to the point of having enough doses for our entire population, we should be in a position, and many of us feel deeply about this as both a practical and a moral responsibility to get the excess doses as quickly as possible into the places where they need to be. And I take your point, that has to be done with great care and thoughtfulness, not just on a political basis, but where we're going to save the most lives. And totally agree with you that healthcare providers in all kinds of places, even the places that aren't current hotspots, ought to be looked at. And we need good data. If we've learned anything over the course of the last 15 months, is you don't want to wait until you actually see hospitalizations and deaths going up and then react. You got to see when you see the first uptick in cases, or the first uptick in positive tests, or the first uptick in wastewater surveillance. And that's when you need to act. And we need to think about that globally too.
Real quickly, do you see the Biden administration accelerating its export efforts in the immediate future?
I think the Biden administration is totally engaged in this as the next step that needs to happen, with Tony Fauci there as the chief medical advisor, somebody who in many ways was the author, at least the co-author of PEPFAR. You can be darn sure this view of the need to take on our global responsibility is being discussed at the highest levels.
Great.
And David, if I can just say, it isn't only the US. I mean, you pointed me to Francis, but India was our largest supplier because they're the largest by volume supplier in the world. Because of their surge, they've taken those vaccines domestically, which has meant that countries that were expecting vaccines from India didn't get them. So it's not, this is a global issue, not just a US issue.
Great. Combining two questions from members Gayle Bronner and Aurora Austriaco about proselytizing or evangelizing the benefits of getting the vaccine. So we talked briefly about government requiring vaccines. How important is it that businesses and employers require vaccination as a requirement to get back, really getting adoption? And does money talk? So Dr. Ngozi, Dr. Ezike, I will start with you. Should Illinois and Chicago employers be requiring the vaccine? And then I'd like to get a national perspective from Dr. Collins.
Well, I know that money does talk, and I know that there are things that people want to do. And if the obstacle to getting to where they want to go is the vaccination, people who are like, I didn't really want it, will say, well, I guess I maybe didn't want it, but I need it to do X. And so it is a very logical line that having, employers or business people or events organizers wanting to ensure that their event business site is safe, that they would in fact require something that gives their business a chance to be safe. And I understand that people want to have choice, so you could have it where people are continually being tested, continually putting swabs up their nose or spitting out saliva, or they get the vaccine. I think it's great to have all those choices, but I think after a while, hopefully people would tend towards that vaccination, and the business community can absolutely support and help that.
And Dr. Collins, would you strongly encourage, or do you think there's a real concerted effort that needs to be made among businesses to require vaccinations in order to ensure employment?
Yeah, I think that's very much a decision private institutions need to make. It's very clear that this is an issue that electrifies a lot of people's reactions and resistance. The nastiest emails I get, including ones that threaten the health of my family, come from people who think that the government is going to issue a mandate for this vaccine. So there's a great deal of strong emotion around this. Legally, at the present time, since these vaccines are approved under what's called emergency use, part of that says that the government may not mandate their use. It would require a full permanent approval, as what's called a BLA, to make that even a possibility. I have 40,000 people who work for me at NIH. I'm encouraging them in the strongest way I know how to get vaccinated, especially those that have patient care responsibilities in our hospital. But I can't require it at the present time. That would be across a line. I do think if you could look a little bit further forward and we get over maybe some of the emotion here, that certainly for people who have patient care responsibilities, who are interacting with vulnerable individuals, it's hard to defend saying, oh, it's fine if you're not vaccinated in that situation. Just like we don't say it's fine if you don't get your flu shot. It will sort of fall into that rhythm of other kinds of protections that we'd expect healthcare providers to take advantage of and maybe even require. When it comes to businesses, I think that's up to individual businesses to figure out the pros and cons. There will be unhappy people. There'll be people who quit. There'll be people who probably file lawsuits. But if it's the way in which you think your business can flourish because you can bring everybody back, well, think about that. I'd rather, though, as we're sort of trying to convince the resistant folks to sign up, to do more emphasizing of why it's going to be a wonderful thing for you to be freed of this sense of impending doom and fear that we've all had for the last 15 months, that you can actually bring people to your house who are also immunized and have dinner together, and you can hug people that you haven't hugged in a year. I got to say, now that it's possible to do that, my wife and I are finding that amazingly liberating. If we could spread that word a little better, maybe that would help too.
Two final quick questions. Dr. Berkley, you've probably seen the news that Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York announced that the city will reopen fully July 1. Possibility that the city of Chicago may do so in the not so distant future. Having a global perspective on cities, countries, and states that have done it right and those that didn't do it right, what would be the 2 or 3 pieces of advice that you would give cities and states that are looking to reopen that are critical to its success and sustainability?
Well, number one, I would start where Francis did, which is I would be encouraging people in the US where you have vaccines and the ability to do that to get coverage as high as possible. But we also do need to still be careful. And I think it's really important to, around the world, we still see it's 9 consecutive weeks where cases are going up, and we still don't have full protection, which means people have to be smart about it. It means using masks when they are in close contact with people they don't know the status of. It's about frequent hand washing. It's about not having large gatherings. And I think one of the things we've seen over and over again is you're in complete lockdown and then you're completely open. And completely open may be things like you're going to sports stadiums and piling in next to each other with people screaming for their favorite team. You know, I think it's about having good public health principles and then trying to get prevention out as best as possible and to do it in a reasonable way.
One quick lightning round for all 3 of you before we conclude. If we were sitting here on April 29th, 2022, 1 year ago from 1 year ahead from now, and you were writing the headline about the state of COVID-19, what would it be? And I'll start with you, Dr. Collins.
Well, I'd like it to be highly effective oral antiviral agent approved for broad public use.
Great. Dr. Ezike.
Coronavirus has been sufficiently maintained, very few cases noted week over week, and there's an effective cure that helps treat people quickly and effectively.
Great. And Dr. Berkley.
High-risk people across the world are protected with these powerful new vaccines. Hopefully, we don't need new vaccines, but if we do, that they're available for everyone.
And I know I share the opinion of our members that we hope all of those headlines end up being true if we were to reconvene a year from now. So Doctors Berkley, Collins, and Ezike, thank you for visiting with the Economic Club today. And Dr. Gayle, thank you again for leading such a thoughtful discussion.